I'm on. I can't see any of you, but you can see me.
Yeah, we got it. You're on. Anyone have hearing problems now? Oh. Thank you, Richie, for your unfiltered expression where we survived it.
You were loud, in case you're wondering, Richie, but it wasn't your fault.
Look at that.
So, Richie, I want to begin by thank you for the practice this morning. I'm so grateful that we had that opportunity to be with you in that way. And apropos of that, we're also so grateful to come together once again. I was mentioning, Richie and I first met in 1992 in Dharamsala during a Mind and Life meeting on sleeping, dreaming, and dying that was being moderated by Francisco. And many more memories from that time, including we were discussing in the faculty office, how neurocentric in a certain way the study of meditation has become. And that part of, what Richie and also Mind and Life Europe community and what we're doing here is to really explore the inactive perspective of practice. And not so much around the commodification and the capitalizing of meditation, but to see, what meditation can actually do in relation to our lives as we meet a world in turmoil, as we meet our very tangled world. And this has been a powerful 30-some years of friendship where the field has, in neuroscience, has really changed in character. It's been wonderful to watch this transformation from bringing not only the very clear perspectives in conventional science to bear on what's happening in the brain and the mind in relation to states that are non-ordinary, so to speak, but we hope to make more ordinary. But also to understand that there is an aspect of this which has to do with social and environmental responsibility. That all of the endeavors that we do to actually bring our lives in alignment with the sense of flourishing or well-being is not just a personal self-improvement program, but it's providing, if you will, a certain kind of substrate where we can connect with the world in a way that is deeply ethical, unvarnished, and also engaged in the foundations of compassion. So Upaya has been a place where this exploration has been happening directly and indirectly. As you know, we have a big emphasis here on social engagement and social service with so many clinicians and chaplains coming through this setting and training, educators, lawyers, people in politics. And one of our greatest friends actually is Tom Udall, who's now the ambassador to New Zealand, but he's part of our community. And we realize that Upaya, its, if you will, brand, is the brand of no brand. It's the brand of actually how do we benefit others, just that, benefit others. And understanding that we have a deep responsibility at this time of polycrisis to meet a world which is tangled with this kind of insight and courage that we've been exploring in the hours of our fantastic encounter with these big brain mammal friends of ours. So thank you. One thing is very clear. I want to acknowledge that we received modest funding over the years from a good friend who actually died week before last. So right before he died, he actually made it possible for us to open this to the public to a little bit, to have people on site. So I'm so grateful for that. but now he's gone. And just to say, your donations to Upaya make a huge difference in how we take care of our faculty. As I've said, we can look at real estate as assets. You can look at what's in your bank account as an asset, but really the assets here are the people. And that includes our teachers, how we actually support our teachers in bringing the best forward and inspiring people to bring practice into the center of their lives and to actualize practice in their everyday lives. And so this is all those who are online, and over 900 people registered online for this. I just encourage both online and on-site. We made a huge discount on this program because I didn't know we would get any funding, because I didn't know if I could pay for the faculty and transportation and so on. But your donations make a huge difference in how we take care of the faculty and how we take care of Upaya and how we take care of you. So please give generously. And also, next year, I'm hoping that we'll find another angel or two. But I want to offer special thanks to you, Richie, for our long friendship. We have stirred many waters together. We have been in many complex academic political battles, so to speak, with great cheer. And we have also ridden the wave of this field for decades. And I feel extraordinary appreciation for what you have brought to the field, and watching it proliferate in both the context of science, but also the experience of practice. And it means a lot to me personally. It's one thing, as somebody who's been practicing since the mid-60s, to have, an old-time practitioner, an old-time practitioner, so to speak, leading the practices. But to me, it's very powerful to see that the first-person experience is being carried by the scientists in this particular weekend. That, it's not just the professional meditators like myself, but it's very strong message to young people. You can be a contemplative and a scientist. Your first-person experience is valuable. And of course, I'm a contemplative and social activist. And this is important to understand. The contemplative experience is the foundation for how it is to be in a world in a way that is principled and fun. Fun is really important. So I'm going to turn this over to John, who will introduce Richie, and just huge appreciation for you, dear friend.
I have a lavalier on, which I think is working. So yes, thank you so much, Roshi. It's really great to be here. I worry hearing about a Pali crisis. It makes me think there's also a Sanskrit crisis. I'll be here all week. So no, but seriously, it is great. We need to have fun. We need to laugh even in the face of the Pali crisis, and to bring ourselves joy. And that's one of the things I love about working with Richie, is we always, there's always a moment of laughter, isn't there, Richie? Like, there's always a time when we at least smile, if not laugh out loud. And we met back when Richie was starting these very important ADAPT studies with Mingyur Rinpoche as a key figure there, and our colleague Antoine Lutz, who was the final student of Francisco Varela, actually. And Richie, of course, is a very well-known scientist who made his name in affective neuroscience, and let there be light. And but he then also has been a leader in contemplative science, a very important leader who's really set the ground for the kind of rigorous work that the Center for Healthy Minds, which he created, has done now for, almost 2 decades, more than 2 decades, actually. And he has many publications. He's one of the top cited scientists in the United States and even in the world. there's much more I could say about him, but as a colleague and friend, I'll just say I value him immensely. And as a fellow bike rider, I still feel our bike ride from last weekend, which he knows all about. So without further ado, but I will say we're going to really try to keep these talks to 45 minutes, nudge, nudge, Richie. And I also will try to do that, or even less. We're planning that we're going to probably go into the Samu time starting at 11. So in the schedule it says we stop at 11, but we expect to go beyond that so that there will be more time for conversation and hopefully some time for some conversation with you as well. We've been looking at your questions, and I think you've already heard we're not necessarily explicitly answering those questions, but they're definitely informing us in the way we're speaking and in our dialogues. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Richie. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Richie. Take it away.
Thank you so much, dear John, and thank you, dear Roshi.
Just a sec, Richie. We have a volume issue.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but it's very low.
Okay.
There it goes.
Can you hear me now? Better?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So thank you all so much. Thank you, dear John and dear Roshi. I really miss being there. I have been reflecting on Upaya. And this time of year, sorry, there's background noise. But this time of year, each year, when I sit down and prepare for this presentation, this is really one of the very few presentations that I give that I actually prepare for in a serious way. I mean, I'm just being bluntly honest, and I really relish this opportunity because speaking with colleagues, friends, family at Upaya is a very different experience, and it provides a forum for the most authentic kind of presentation that I can imagine as a hybrid scientist contemplative activist. With that as a little bit of background, I'm going to show some slides. So let me share my screen. Can you all see that? Someone give me a yes or no.
Looks good.
Okay, great. And can you see the next one here? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, thank you. So, yeah, so I'm gonna, this presentation is one I've never given anything remotely like this before. And it's really, I want to give it in the spirit of deep reverence and appreciation for all of the previous colleagues at this symposium who have spoken. I was sitting on the edge of my seat yesterday listening to the presentations, and I really loved everyone and deeply honored everyone. I want to use this opportunity to share with you some reflections that in some ways are similar and build on issues that have already been discussed, but also introduce one theme that really hasn't been featured before. You'll hear about it in the first part of my presentation. So I want to start with the four thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma, and this comes from the Nundro, or preliminary practices in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. These are reflections that are part of a period of practice that usually is the start of what people do, contemplatives do when they're on a traditional 3-year Vajrayana retreat. The first roughly 6 months is devoted to Nundro. And the first piece of Nundro is reflections on these four thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma. And the first one is the preciousness of this human birth. The second is death and impermanence. The third is karma, or the principle of cause and effect. And the fourth is the inherent dissatisfaction of samsara. I want to spend a little bit of time on the first of these thoughts, the preciousness of this human birth. And one of the classic texts in the Nundro is this really extraordinary volume from the great Nyingma yogi, Patrul Rinpoche. He was someone who lived in the 1800s, and this book, The Words of My Perfect Teacher, is an important text that is often used as part of the Nundro teachings. And I'd like to read to you this incredible passage, and there are many like this, but I just will read you one. And it's on this theme of the preciousness of the human life. So Patrul Rinpoche said, to practice the real, authentic Dharma, it is absolutely necessary to be a human being. Now, suppose that you did not have the support of a human form, but had the highest form of life in the three lower realms, that of an animal. Even the most beautiful and highly prized animal known to man. If someone said to you, quote, say, Om Mani Padme Hum once, and you will become a Buddha, you would be quite incapable of understanding his words or grasping their meaning, nor would you be able to utter a word. In fact, even if you were dying of cold, you would be unable to think of anything to do but lie in a heap. Whereas a man, no matter how weak, would know how to shelter in a cave or under a tree, and would gather wood and make a fire to warm his face and hands. If animals are incapable of such simple things, how can they ever conceive of practicing Dharma? Patrul Rinpoche. So there's a whole, there's like 100 pages of this in The Words of My Perfect Teacher, giving one example after another. And it is really intended to have us, I think, have this come to a place of reverence and deep appreciation and almost awe at the rarity of a human birth and the extraordinary opportunities that we have. And in the prayer that you all say, Upaya, every night, don't squander your life, it's really about the same issue, about the preciousness of this birth that we've been given and the opportunity that we have to practice Dharma. So now moving to how this has been framed in the more conventional psychological literature, the human capacity for self-transformation and self-transcendence. And I will argue that this is one of the several capacities that are likely uniquely human. And so first, I want to introduce someone that I'm sure all of you know, Viktor Frankl. This was one of his early statements that was published in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology in 1966. He talks about the capacity of man for self-transcendence. And he says, in fact, it is a constitutive characteristic of being human, that it always points and is directed to something other than itself. It is therefore a severe and grave misinterpretation of man to deal with him as if he were a closed system. Actually, being human profoundly means to be open to the world, a world which is replete with other beings to encounter and with meanings to fulfill. And in the more modern psychological literature, this is a paper from 2017, very recent, on the varieties of self-transcendent experience. And one of the key messages that these psychologists have, one of them is a psychiatrist, have proposed is that self-transcendent experiences are much more common than we might have previously thought. And they give many examples in this article of common self-transcendent experiences with nature, with so-called flow experiences. I just want to read to you from William James, who also was deeply concerned with the nature of self-transcendent experience and wrote about it extensively in his Varieties of Religious Experience. James said, we can experience union with something larger than ourselves, and in that union, we experience the greatest peace. James also said, and this is something he was quoting from another, he said, he was quoting this person as saying, I felt myself one with the grass, the trees, birds, insects, everything in nature. I exulted in the mere fact of existence, of being part of it all. I knew so well the satisfaction of losing self in a perception of supreme power and love. So these self-transcendent experiences where we experience something beyond ourselves is an experience that human beings have a propensity to seek. And this is something that is deeply connected to our sense of meaning and to really what it is to be human. So I want to now introduce you more formally to these four pillars of well-being, or a healthy mind, or flourishing. We can use those terms synonymously for now, that we introduced in a paper that we published a few years ago. For those of you who participated in the practice earlier this morning, I did a little practice around these four pillars of well-being. And I just will very briefly introduce them and ask questions about the extent to which these qualities that are named in these four pillars are ones that may be uniquely human. So the first is awareness. And we heard from Kristen yesterday a beautiful, beautiful presentation on consciousness in animals, which I very strongly resonated with and deeply appreciated. And awareness, we can have a discussion about this later. One of the questions I raised is the extent to which the awareness or consciousness is similar across species, whether awareness or consciousness in a mollusk is similar or different from a human, and how similar or different, in what ways is it similar or different? These are questions that we can ask. One of the qualities that's part of this awareness pillar is this quality of meta-awareness. It's the capacity to know what our minds are doing. This is a really important attribute of our repertoire. And we believe it is a necessary ingredient for all forms of human transformation. That is, we can't transform unless we have meta-awareness, unless we actually know what our minds are doing. And to some of you, that may seem like a strange phrase. Don't we always know what our minds are doing? I'm sure many of you, I certainly have had the experience of reading a book where we might be reading each word on a page, and we might be reading one page, a second page, and after a few minutes, we have no friggin' idea what we've just read. Our mind is somewhere else. The moment we recognize that is a moment of meta-awareness, and that's actually something that can be cultivated. And the capacity to cultivate meta-awareness, or even I would go further and say the propensity to cultivate meta-awareness, is something that I think is, I would suggest tentatively, is uniquely human. The second capacity or pillar of well-being is connection. And again, connection is clearly elements of connection we see throughout the animal kingdom in many different ways. I think that it reaches a certain height, if you will, or quality in humans where we have the capacity to extend our circles of connection vastly beyond our immediate in-group, beyond our kin, and really to all beings. This is, of course, the practice that we do, widening our circles of compassion. And so, again, the capacity to cultivate this quality, which we believe we all come into the world with, and in a elemental form is present throughout phylogeny, but the capacity to cultivate it is something that is, I think, a special quality that we find in humans. The third quality, insight, is about self-knowledge, self-inquiry, and self-transcendence. This is the capacity to not only know what our minds are doing, but understand that our thoughts, our beliefs, our expectations, the narrative that we all carry around about ourselves literally dictates the reality that we hold. And again, what's uniquely human is the capacity to transform our relationship to this narrative and to change the narrative itself. And what is really important for well-being initially as we begin this kind of cultivation is not so much changing the content of the narrative, but really it's changing our relationship to this narrative. And finally, purpose, staying motivated, clarifying our values. Here again, we think this is something, particularly the cultivation of purpose and the capacity to harness the opportunity of the everyday activities of our lives and connect them to our deepest purpose and meaning is something that is, I think, uniquely human. So I've asked these questions as I was going along: self-awareness and meta-awareness, compassion toward members of an outgroup, insight and purpose. The question concerns whether we might think of these, and particularly the cultivation of these, as afforded by our unique human birth. So I want to introduce you to an article now, very old paper that was published in 2004 in Daedalus by Jerry Kagan. Jerome Kagan was a very famous developmental psychologist who passed away very, very recently. And I chose this picture of Jerry to show to you because it brings back extremely fond memories. He was one of my advisors when I was a graduate student, and I spent many, many, many hours in the office that you see there with Jerry smoking his pipe. He was one of the most brilliant psychologists that I have ever encountered. And he published this paper in 2004 called The Uniquely Human in Human Nature. And in this paper, he lists 7 qualities, um, uh, 4 of which he considers qualitative differences, and 3 of which he considers quantitative differences from other living beings. And I'll share these with you. Now, of course, in 2004, there was not the hysteria about AI that there is today. So we can think about the extent to which these qualities may also be instantiated in silicon. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But for now, let me just go through what Jerry said in this paper. So the first qualitative difference is that humans have the capacity to develop a theory of mind. That is a theory of other minds. That is recognizing that other beings have beliefs, desires, and expectations that guide their experience and their behavior. The second quality is language. And, when Jerry wrote this, he was very well aware of experiments that had been done with chimpanzees and other species, but he argued that there's a qualitative difference in the symbolic language that humans have. Morality is a third. And the fourth is meta-awareness. Now, I think that we can quibble with all of these, and I'm sure we will if there's time. But Jerry argued that at least there is a qualitative difference in the ways in which these qualities are expressed in humans compared to other species. He also named 3 additional qualities that he thought were more quantitative differences. The first is mental time travel. Our capacity to reflect on the past and to anticipate the future. And this is something very, very important. There's a very well-known neurobiologist at Stanford, a good friend of mine named Robert Sapolsky, and Robert wrote a book that was very well known when it first came out, called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the short answer to why zebras don't get ulcers is because they don't do mental time travel. They don't have the same capacity to ruminate about the past and worry about their future. They have a much less well-developed prefrontal cortex, which is an important substrate of mental time travel. One of the things that I often reflect about is that this capacity to do mental time travel and the prefrontal cortex that seems to be associated with it in ways that we still are trying to understand. This is a part of the brain that also is really important for self-regulation. And one of the things that seems very apparent, although again, I don't know that there really is robust evidence on this, is that humans have a great capacity, one of the, and I would put it as a quantitative difference, to self-regulate their behavior, to self-regulate, for example, their attention or self-regulate their emotions. And with it comes also the capacity to dysregulate our behavior and our emotions. And I think most people would agree that the prevalence of psychopathology is much greater in humans than it is in the animal kingdom. And again, I think that that's probably true because of this endowment that we have to engage in mental time travel and to get lost in the past and the future and have it obscure the present. Another quantitative difference that Jerry noted is our quest for novelty. While novelty seeking is certainly observable in many different parts of the animal kingdom, the extent to which humans seek novelty is really vastly greater than we might see at other levels in phylogeny. And this is, Jerry specifically attributes this to anatomical differences in the brain. And he talks about the role of the central nucleus of the amygdala. And the amygdala plays an important role in detecting novelty. And in many species, novel environments or novel stimuli will elicit fear. And Jerry attributes this to the relatively larger central nucleus of their amygdala compared to humans. Clearly, this is very speculative. I don't want to place too much stock in this particular theory, but whatever it might be, the differences in novelty, I think, are apparent. And finally, the last quantitative difference he names is the ability to dissociate survival to reproductive maturity from inclusive fitness. And basically, the argument here is that humans have the capacity to willingly choose not to procreate, to willingly choose not to create offspring, and this is something that is further developed in humans than it is in other species, the capacity to voluntarily make that kind of decision. Okay, so I want to call attention to a few other features that I think are really important. And one is this issue of domain generality and access to the cognitive unconscious. And I want to bring your attention to a piece that was written many, many years ago that I think is still, in my view, is one of the most creative integrations that I have seen ever done by a psychologist. Really one of my favorite papers in all of academic psychology. And it's probably, most of you don't know this, but some may. Molly probably knows this. And it's a paper that was published in 1976 called The Evolution of Intelligence and Access to the Cognitive Unconscious, written by Paul Rozin. And what Paul Rozin argues in this paper is essentially the following. He takes many examples throughout the animal kingdom of extraordinary intelligence. For example, the intelligence of bees who are communicating to their conspecifics about the location of food sources, and the complex dances that they do, the communicative function of bird song, many qualities of this kind. And Rozin gives example after example of this. And he then argues that what is unique about humans is our capacity to to connect these domains of specialized intelligence to form a kind of domain general intelligence that we can apply across the board, if you will. And so in these cases of specialized intelligence that we see in many different parts of the animal kingdom, these are kind of restricted domains of intelligence. They do not have this kind of generality. And so the intelligence that's exhibited in a specific domain is exhibited in just that domain. It cannot be harnessed and exploited and brought to bear on other domains. And Rosen argues that what is unique about humans is this domain generality. And so for those of you who are interested, I urge you to go back to this. I wish that this paper were cited more frequently in the modern scientific literature, but I still remember the visceral sense of excitement that I had when I first read this paper when it had just come out. Okay, also, I think is important to name is the notion that kindness and pro-social behavior may be at our core and part of our inborn tendencies. The propensity to flourish, and this is really connected to our seeking opportunities for self-transcendence and self-transformation. Of course, self-transformation explicitly and self-transcendence and spirituality. So these are aspects of life that really are uniquely found in the human form. And I won't go over this in detail, but there is now a growing corpus of evidence for this kind of prosociality that begins in very young preverbal infants. And I've actually at a prior Varela Symposium gone through some of these data in detail, but these are just examples of experimental paradigms that are used in infants to show that the vast majority of human infants exhibit this very strong propensity for prosocial behavior that some have called an innate moral core. I also want to bring attention to this idea that human biology is wet and interpersonal and analog, and specifically call attention to touch. This is something that has not been featured in any AI that I know of, and yet humans can't actually develop without touch. One of the people that brought this to light very early on is the anthropologist Ashley Montagu, and he wrote a lot about the skin and touch and its criticality for human development. We know from experimental research, and again, this is not something uniquely human, it may be more developed in humans, but touch is absolutely necessary for normal human development. This has been shown in famous experiments in rhesus monkeys by Harry Harlow. So I want to now shift to talk explicitly about AI. And here I think you'll find my view very similar to the view that was beautifully articulated by Molly. I'll introduce this with the question, what sliver of intelligence is AI intended to mimic or capture? I want to just share with you a paper that appeared not too long ago in the Stanford Business Review that reflects on the contrast between the capacities that may be embodied by AI and those that may be uniquely human. And so this author lists attributes that humans have that are shared with AI: doing computations, using language, implementing rules, forecasting the future, using logic, communicating, recognizing faces, remembering things, sensing temperatures, detecting sounds, and this list can go on and on. In humans, I can't read all of this in my screen because it's being blocked by the, oh, I can move it now, yeah. So what's distinctive to humans: having culture, holding beliefs, having a sense of humor, being moral, being spiritual, having desires, feeling happy, feeling love, having a personality, having relationships. These are all features that may be distinctly human. And some of the things that are labeled as distinctly human belong to the category of emotions. And I want to share with you, since this is a symposium celebrating the work of Francisco, share with you, well, actually, that's coming a little later. But before I do that, I want to consider this question. Whether AI is really all that it is cracked up to be. And I just, given all the hype about AI, and there's a recent New York Times article that talked about some of this, I felt compelled to just put a few cautious notes in here, just by way of helping us to appreciate some of these limitations. So this is a paper that was just published in 2024, and there was a claim made that ChatGPT-4 can ace the bar exam. This is a scientist from MIT who did this analysis. And he found, rather than 90%, as was claimed by Google engineers, this MIT scientist found performance on the uniform bar exam portion to be approximately 48% and 15% on the essay portion for the most realistic implementation of the AI. Some of the claims that are being made are, I think, overblown. Another claim that was made is that artificial intelligence is massively opening the possibility of discovering new materials. So this is from two very prominent scientists. Anthony Cheatham was a professor and directed a center at Oxford on this for many years. And this is from a major material science journal. And I just want to read you this one passage. This brings us to the final point concerning the claim of an order of magnitude expansion in stable materials known to humanity. This was the claim made again by a group of Google engineers. We would respectfully suggest that the work by Merchant et al. Does not report any new materials, but reports a list of proposed compounds. In our view, a compound can be called a material when it exhibits some functionality and therefore has potential utility. Since no functionality has been demonstrated from the 384,870 compositions that were claimed to be found by AI in the stable structured database that they published, they cannot yet be regarded as materials. And even in the financial world, one of the biggest investors in tech said that, this is someone that predicted the dot-com bust. He thinks AI is a bubble that will very soon deflate. This guy, Jeremy Grantham. So many reasons to approach this cautiously. And what about things like affect and touch and smell and taste and qualia? And here I want to bring in Francisco. This is a paper of Francisco's that was published in I can't read the date here, in 2000 something, early 2000s, in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, the paper called it The Source of Time. And it's a paper about emotion. And I want to read you a passage that Francisco wrote about this. He said, "Our focus here has been to argue that affect emotion is not simply one among many types of aspects of lived experience. They are generative for consciousness itself." And the italics are in the original. So Francisco clearly appreciated the significance of emotion, affect for lived conscious experience itself as a fundamental generative quality. And finally, I want to end now. I'm going to end with just 2 more slides and really talk about the farther reaches of human nature beyond concepts, beyond duality itself. And this is from the third Karmapa, really one of my very favorite and most precious practices that I've had the opportunity to do. And I'll read you this. Whoops. Let me just get my cursor so I can move this. All phenomena are projections of the mind, yet there is no mind. It is empty of any essence. Empty yet unobstructed, it can manifest as anything. Investigating it with care, may we cut through to the ground. Non-existent self-appearances are mistaken for objects. Due to ignorance, self-awareness is mistaken for self. We wander through samsara under the sway of dualistic fixation. May we completely cut the root of ignorance and confusion. Mind does not exist, for even the Buddhas do not see it. Yet neither does it not exist. It is the basis of samsara and nirvana. This is not a contradiction, but a unity, the middle way. May the stream of effortless experience flow without ceasing. Clinging to good experiences is freed on its own. The confusion of negative thoughts is naturally purified into basic space. Ordinary mind is beyond being accepted or rejected. It cannot be lost or gained. May we realize this freedom from concepts, the truth of reality itself. Beings have always been Buddhas by their very nature. Yet not knowing this, they wander endlessly in samsara. For those beings who experience suffering without end, may overwhelming compassion take birth in our minds. In the moment of love, with the unceasing force of unbearable compassion, the truth of the empty essence nakedly dawns. This unity is the unerring supreme path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richie. We're going to transition now to having a 15-minute, I think, conversation with our panelists. And is Evan online?
Yes, I am.
Great. Good to see you. And Kristen? Not sure if Kristen joined us today.
Yes, I'm here too.
Oh,
Hi,
great.
everybody.
Oh, great. Wonderful. So let's, I think Noah's going to set us up with the appropriate Zoom setup. But even while he's working on that, we can begin with any responses. Kristen, since Richie was talking about animal the differences between human and animal consciousness, I kind of want to invite you right off the bat to maybe reflect on that.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to do that. And Richie, I'm really grateful that you opened this conversation, because it's a conversation I've been wanting to have. I've been having with myself mostly. I have a paper draft on my computer that's called Meditating Monkeys, that I wrote a draft of years and years ago. I think that you and I have some disagreements about what animals can do. But I also think that we have some agreements that there's something unique about what humans are doing. And I think this conversation will help us identify, might be able to help us identify what exactly, like what are the fine details of difference there. Yeah, I just wanted to share a story of Santino, a chimpanzee in Sweden. Just to give you an example of the sorts of things chimpanzees do. So he was being kept in a zoo, and it was a zoo that opened every May so that the visitors could come in. But the rest of the winter, he didn't have to deal with visitors. His keeper said he didn't like the visitors. And so they observed him stockpiling pieces of concrete from his cage and hiding them under the hay. And when the visitors came in on the very first day, he threw concrete at them. So this looks like some kind of a mental time travel of planning ahead for the future, of having things he likes and doesn't like, and figuring out how to deal with his unfortunate situation. We've learned a lot about animal cognition and behavior. So Richie, if at some point we could have a conversation in depth, I would love to have that conversation and look at the pillars in really careful detail to try to identify where there are similarities and where there are real differences.
Yeah, no, if I can respond, I just, I love that example. And I deeply honor and appreciate your incredible work, Kristen. And I really love what you're doing. And the implications I strongly agree with. In the case of mental time travel, one of the examples Jerry Kagan uses in his paper is he says, as a 70-year-old man, I can reflect on my third grade teacher and remember the impact she had on my life. That's something that I don't think a chimpanzee can do. And he named that as one of the quantitative differences, not qualitative differences. So I, don't at all disagree that a chimpanzee can do mental time travel. I think that it is a question there of more subtle nuance, the quantitative capacities, and you had a beautiful call at the end of your talk in response to my question of the kind of research that we need to do, and I very strongly agree with that.
I want to welcome also Amy and Luke. I'm glad to see you're joining us from Europe. I wasn't sure if you'd be here this morning, so great to see you. Anyone else have thoughts, responses?
Okay, I'll just do one quick one.
Yeah.
Aliens. Finally got a chance to bring aliens into it. No, I think one of the listening to your dialogue, one of the things that's interesting in the work we do when we do techno-signatures and think about looking for, life on other planets, intelligent life, is how broad the idea of mind might be, right? And I think that's just something I really want to engage with people who do, study this, because we ask like, well, okay, there's humans and chimpanzees, and then we can go all the way to the nematodes, and but what other possible structures of mind are there? Because these are all still Earth's lineage. So I don't know where that goes, but I just wanted to raise that possibility that, like a forest, when we talk about the wood wide web, and people talk about forests having some kind of cognitive capacity, just because you see them moving stuff around to help a part of the forest. And we don't want to necessarily think of this as like, oh, this is like a human mind, but it's doing this, but it may be an entirely different kind of mind. So I just, I don't even know where that goes, but it is something I'm interested in and have to think about if I'm looking for signatures of technology, on another world.
Yeah, I mean, do you need a central nervous system?
Do you have a mic, Roshi? Okay. Yeah, exactly. Roshi said, do you need a central nervous system? Do you want to say more?
Well, I'm just wondering, one of the criteria that Richie articulated was wet. And, what kind of biology supports what we understand to be mind, but actually we haven't said yet what we mean by mind.
And I think this is actually, Adam and I talked briefly about this last night, which is actually in some ways the word mind, and I wonder what Evan might think about this as a philosopher, and also Kristen for that matter, is whether in some ways that's a more useful word than consciousness, because consciousness maybe brings in more of our kind of phenomenal assumptions, if you like, about what we're talking about. And I'm actually going to raise some of that, the question of phenomenality, in my own talk. And part of that, of course, is then, how accessible are the minds of others actually to us? So that's part of, I think, there are certain doubts in the Buddhist tradition about what conclusions we can draw about animals and other people, for that matter. So I'm not sure I share quite Richie's same level of confidence about what animals are or are not capable of. I see my dog Nandi, seeming he's a poodle. Poodles are known to be very human-like. And sometimes he sure seems like he's got a lot of meta-awareness and mental time travel going on. He hasn't gotten to the point of storing stones, because I don't think he can throw them, but still. So on that note, I'm just wondering, how accessible really, and this is a problem that Kristen raised, how accessible really are these questions?
Evan. Oh,
Luke.
Luke, okay. Luke first, then Ev.
Okay, so well, I'm grateful to Richie because he put some question marks to the hype around AI, and maybe I did not do that enough in my own presentation because I didn't want to become negative, but I'm personally astounded by the attributions that are made to AI. And I'm saying this, well, partly because I've been involved in this field for a long time. And and also because I know what is going on, what is going on in these systems. And I think Evan already mentioned that we should not attribute semantics or meaning to a system like ChatGPT. That it is a statistical machine. Now, it is astounding that purely based on statistics, you can mimic enough of texts and other kinds of things that it seems that there is meaning and understanding going on, but you only have to probe a little bit deeper, and then you immediately find the boundaries and the limitations of this particular technology. And it is because it's based on a view of the mind which is very impoverished, well, compared to what Richie was also talking about in his talk, all these different aspects of mind. So I don't know when people will become aware of this, but I could just say that I'm happy that he brought up this point, and we should be very critical and not accept the hype that is streaming out of Silicon Valley, or put our faith into these systems because they do not deserve it.
Well, that certainly.
Thank you for
takes care
that.
of that. Thank you. Okay. As one of the pioneers in the field, we appreciate your honesty, and we hope no AI investors are online, or those anticipating vast funding.
So we'll take maybe one or two more comments or questions, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. Anyone else? Amy, do you have a thought?
Oh, you're on mute, Amy.
Did you want to say something?
Yes.
Richie, I was very touched and interested in everything you said, including the references to the Kagan article and a number of older articles, and particularly touched by your reflection on what kind of wisdom can be cultivated from understanding the preciousness of and the rarity of human birth. And in that light, and also in the light of what Luke was just saying and what we've been talking about in terms of the limits of AI, I'm wondering what you think about the type of surrogate that's become so popular in the science meditation world, i.e. The meditation apps.
Well, you know, we actually, our organization has put out one of them. You know, I think if we're successful, people will use it to start their practice, and then we'll get rid of it. You know, I think that these things might be helpful in as early reminders, so I think that they serve some potentially useful function. But you know, we have this meditation app, and I never ever use it. So. You know, and my wish is that people, if they start using it, will find themselves just having the practice be their intrinsic motivation and continue on their own. So, yeah, I think that with regard to the more general question of technology, I mean, the technology is here to stay, and I think that we have a moral responsibility to do two things. One is to educate our children in digital hygiene so that they can not get hijacked by these devices. The Surgeon General of the United States recently issued a report on social media and youth mental health, and the crisis is enormous. So that's a huge issue. And the second is that we can change our relationship to the technology and actually harness the technology for things that actually might be useful. And we can learn to use it in those ways. And so I think it's possible. I think it can play a constructive role. But we have a long way to go. And we're fighting a very difficult battle with the tech companies. I mean, Europe, I think, is doing a much better job than the United States in terms of regulation. You know, I see the EU is really leading now in a way that I think will be helpful to the world.
Molly?
Yeah, thank you, Richie, so much for your remarks. Really obviously sympathetic to many of the arguments you're making. And this discussion has made me think about whether the conversations around the extent to which AI can be human-like might actually be the wrong conversation or a limited conversation. And one worry that I have had and that many others have is that if we go down this road of trying to compare humans to AI, this might sort of shift our notions about what it means to be human or what we value in ourselves. And I wonder if that conversation sort of implicitly sets up a barrier between humans and other forms of life in ways that might be limiting or harmful. And I'm wondering, like, what if we change the conversation to what is lifelike about AI? Because I think that, you know, we might be getting misled by similarities that we see between large language models and human performance, but no one is saying that AI is dog-like or fish-like. And I think Kristen's talk yesterday really profoundly showed how much value there is in sort of broadening the scope of the forms of life that we consider under the umbrella of value and care. And so I'm wondering if one sort of point of resistance to all of the hype around AI and the ethical path that it's taking us dangerously down is really broadening the conversation to life, not humans.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great
Molly.
point to end
Great,
on, I
great
think,
way to
Roshi.
end. And I think the question behind this for me is, we have some sense of the directionality of artificial intelligence, but we have also some sense there is no such thing probably as artificial wisdom.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we're running exactly 10 minutes late. So we are definitely going to run into the Samu period, I'd say, and we may go all the way to 11:30 or so. We'll see how that goes with Roshi's blessing. So let's take a 10-minute break now and be back 10:20. And see you then. All righty. Do we want to switch the image there, Noah? All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Good to see you all back. So, allow me to begin. Actually, before I begin, I just want to say that when I come here to Upaya, which I am so happy to be back, it's wonderful to see this new building. It's an honor to be with you all and with these, and my esteemed colleagues and friends. It's really, I hope I can live up to it all. One of the great things about Upaya for me is it's one of those places where I can be what my friend, many years ago, friend and benefactor Barry Hershey, I don't know if he remembers it, but he kind of said to me once, you're a Buddhist theologian. And I thought, well, there's no theos, but yeah, maybe that's in other words, that there are opportunities to kind of speak from within the tradition. So I'm going to do that today, but I'm going to be a bit more academic than I sometimes am here. Or maybe that's not the right term. I'm going to be a kind of nerdy, is what I'm going to be. We're going to take a bit of a dive into some Buddhist stuff. Some of it you may have heard before. Some of it may be new. I know for some of you, you've heard it before. But for some of you, it may be entirely new. I'll try not to go too fast, being a New Yorker, but I'll do what I can. All right. So in the good Buddha spirit, I'm going to then invoke my lineage, my teachers. Viduta kapana jala gambira dara murti namaha samanta bandrai samanta sparanati shena bhavo napi bhavo sinachera napi shashvataha nanicha napi anityastvam advayaya namostute. Sedan gugu gena buzagi dala deva mabarabzane kadantandra shunlo toba yiloru boba nawazadeza. Oman jugi yigi bodane dusan sangi gungi ngowani ranza jogo ngunzu dunze batawe la meshavla suwade. Okay, and let me just share my screen. So I think, did that work? Oops, sorry. There we go. Looking good? Okay. So, sometimes I'm charged with doing a kind of summary, and it's just so much happened this weekend that I can't quite do a summary, but I'm going to try to touch on a lot of things with a kind of Buddhist inflection. But we are going to take, as I say, we're going to take a bit of a dive into the Buddhist stuff. So I just wanted to, I'm not going to introduce myself. That would seem a little odd and hard to do. But just to give you a little sense of my background, actually, maybe I should say, you can see on this slide my various sort of main affiliations. I'm in the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin. I just completed my rotation as department chair in Asian languages and cultures, very involved in the Student Flourishing Initiative. And I'm also a founding member of our relatively new Transdisciplinary Center for Research in Psychoactive Substances. We weren't really allowed to put the word psychedelics in there, but that's what it means. So hopefully nobody from the legislature, never mind. So here's a couple of recent book-length works. The one on the right with Sarah McClintock is just came out, and this is a translation with working editions of Tibetan and Sanskrit and a great introduction that Sarah did a lot of work on. And that just came out. This is from, of course, the famous philosopher Nagarjuna. And then on the left, a very fascinating project led by His Holiness the Dalai Lama that collects Indian texts that were translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan. Led by Thupten Jinpa, a team of Tibetan scholars did that, and then we translated, Dechen, Rochard, and I translated that into English, and I wrote a series of essays introducing the various parts. A couple of the sort of crossover type articles I do, one of them with Richie on visualizing compassion, one of them with my graduate student, Jeremy Mannheim, who just completed, I think, a great dissertation. Evan was on the committee. And then, something that lots of people are very interested in. I'm a little jaded maybe, but this is about Tukdam, this famous, or maybe not familiar to some of you, notion that there is a kind of meditative state that persists after clinical death, where the body does not decompose as expected. So our first paper was basically a null finding, but we do have a new paper coming out that Richie's also on. And on the right, you can see that's...
It's out. It's out already.
It is out, Richie? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah, it's out.
Well, that was fast. And on the right is a screen capture of a talk I did in connection with a documentary that called Tukdam Between Worlds by Donna Coleman. That's at Stanford. So if you want to learn more about that, you might find that talk to be interesting. That's on YouTube. Okay, so that's kind of just a way of saying kind of some of the stuff I do. So I want to talk a little bit about The Blind Spot, which is really, I think, a great book. I've been enjoying it, haven't listened or read all of it yet. I've actually been listening to it. Some parts of it are hard to listen to, but some of it works. And here's a slide from Adam's presentation, like, how did it happen? Like, how did we get here? And he talks about the scientific workshop, finding structural invariance, and then an ascending spiral of abstraction. And I think there are certain similarities to part of what happens in the kind of Buddhist tradition I'm going to be focusing on, called the Indo-Tibetan Mahayana tradition, which is really a kind of workshop that's also seeking structural invariance. But this is what we might call a different kind of workshop. What's the scientific workshop? Well, here's an excerpt from the book. Once they had invented thermometers, and before the concept of temperature, scientists discovered that the boiling and freezing points of water weren't as precisely fixed in the natural world as they initially thought. This discovery meant that scientists had to intervene and control the context of their measurements as much as possible by manufacturing true fixed points in highly artificial and controlled settings. Highly artificial and controlled settings. This effort required building special places for sequestering the phenomena they were investigating. The aspiring practitioners of thermometry had to build what philosopher of science Robert Crease calls the workshop, the communal, that's an important word, scientific infrastructure required for creating new, precise experiences along with tools for manipulating, investigating, and communicating them. And I think we could take this, kind of mutatis mutandum, make some appropriate changes, and talk about a kind of contemplative workshop, where Buddhist monks and nuns were being trained in a particular kind of way of investigating their own experience. It's crucial, and a very important question, both with science and with contemplative practice is, are you discovering, or are you finding what you're told you're supposed to find? Right? I'm not going to address that question now, but you do find there are certain kinds of conclusions that Buddhists in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, sometimes loosely called, shall we say, the Nalanda tradition of contemplative inquiry, that they came to. And I'm going to really focus especially on this particular figure. What a surprise, my favorite. His name is Dharmakirti, and he is really the most important figure in this style of Indian philosophy that is concerned with what's called pramana, or the instrument of reliable awareness. We can call this Buddhist epistemology. It's really about much more than epistemology, as you will see. He was active in the 7th century. And this is also, as it turns out, a really crucial source for the non-dual traditions, interestingly enough, which you've only really, in academia, only recently come to appreciate. So I'm going to show you a series of slides that are a model of a model, which models are already incomplete. So this model is also going to distort a little bit the Buddhist model. But in the interest of a heuristic that'll help us to understand some of this, and I know some of you have seen some of this before, but I think it will be helpful for us to review if you've already seen it. So here's a basic model of sense perception. There's a causal interaction between what we can call a stimulus, which they would call an object, an alambana, and a sense faculty. And as a result of that, you get a sense impression in the mind. And this sense impression is called a phenomenal form of the object, a grahya akara in Sanskrit. And simultaneously with that is presented a phenomenal form of the subject. And both of these are constantly fluctuating, right? So there isn't a permanent subjectivity or self-observing. There's a sense of subjectivity to which is being presented, or for which is being presented, some kind of phenomenal content, all right? So that creates this sort of subject-object structure within the field of consciousness. So that blue box is representing the field of consciousness. When we look at this in terms of a particularly important kind of cognitive moment that we can call recognition, when you say, oh, this is that, oh, this is blue, the way we can take this model there is we have at time one, we've got, the object on the right-hand side, we've got a sense faculty, we've got consciousness. This is assuming, for the moment, that that object is actually made out of matter. And then there's an interaction. That interaction produces, again, that phenomenal form of the object, along with the phenomenal form of the subject. The object continues in time, but it's unstable. It's constantly fluctuating, as is everything in this model. And then we have a subsequent moment in which we make that identification. Oh, that is blue. So on this model, first of all, an important point here is that it's not like this is a tabula rasa, right? You're not just taking a picture of reality. Your sense faculty is not, and that's why you see different colors here, right? You see this is a kind of mottled blue, and this is a different, slightly different kind of blue. That's because this phenomenal form in your mind is not just a kind of picture of that stimulus. It's already engaged in a kind of processing, if you like, a kind of cognitive process that does not just give you a mirror image of reality. And part of the reason for that is that there's gunk in your mind. So even and that's the thing that's represented at the top here, and you're also in every ordinary state of consciousness, every ordinary state of consciousness, including dream consciousness, you also constantly are presenting with a sense of subjectivity. There are going to be some exceptions we'll talk about later, but there's a constant presentation of a sense of subjectivity. So you've got all this gunk, just includes your affect, your expectations, your conditioning, and so on. And that is already going to condition what is actually a non-conceptual, or if you like, pre-conceptual. And I'm going to use the word conceptual in a specific way I'll describe later. And then you conceptualize, right, this content. So there is a sense in which there are certainly going to be cognitive scientific models that this agrees with, but also lots of models that this won't completely agree with, like a strong version of a predictive processing model. Okay, now when you do this, what's happening is that phenomenal form of the object is acting as a cause for that conceptualization, right? And it's reliable basically when you can track back causally to the object. This is how, according to this theory, this is how conscious beings actually navigate their environments, which includes animals. So, for example, even pigeons use concepts. And here I'd like to refer to this great research by Herrnstein and his colleagues, and I think later it was picked up by John Varela, I believe was his student, about where they taught pigeons how to identify Charlie Brown. There's no evolutionary reason for pigeons to know what Charlie Brown looks like. And, they taught them how to do that, and they successfully did it. I won't say more about it. It's really kind of fun to look at that research. And they said, this is concept use. And for the Buddhist standpoint, it's definitely concept use, for sure. So this concept is only reliable if you can actually act on it in a way that enables you to get what you want. Right? So it's actually very much goal-driven. The conceptualization is goal-driven. And it is also required for conscious action. You cannot engage in conscious agentive action unless you conceptualize on this account. It's not possible. So what kind of ways can we be wrong here, right? We can be wrong because, in other words, what kinds of ways can we not track back causally to that object? So one way we can be wrong is that we just are we don't know how to use the concepts right. We don't understand what a tree really is, how to use the concept of a tree. That's one way that we can be wrong. We can also be wrong in that we misunderstand the sensory information that we're receiving from that non-conceptual moment of experience. Now, in fact, for ordinary persons, that non-conceptual moment is barely accessible. It's possibly phenomenally accessible, but it is certainly not reportable for ordinary persons. Reportability, of course, already means we're into the conceptual, right? So what kinds of errors can we make? Again, we can use concepts wrong, but importantly, we can also misidentify. We can be, in a sense, have data, if you like, if you want to call it that. We can have this kind of sensory information that itself is not adequate to make a proper conceptualization. I can think I see fire, but in fact, I see a particular kind of flower. This is used as an example in texts in India that looks like a flower from afar. I think it's a fire, but it's not. So part of what that means is that in cases where there is dubiety, I need to approach that object and confirm that this is what I think it is. My conceptualizations, in other words, really need to be grounded in an experience. And so we can think of this process, especially the process at the conceptual level, as a kind of intelligence. And I'm here referring to my talk on Wednesday. I know many of you heard that talk, so I'm not going to repeat it, but I just want to, if you haven't heard it, Roshi thinks you should listen to it, so maybe that means you should. So that's a kind, you can think of this as a kind of intelligence, right? You're kind of figuring things out. Oh, is that what I need? This is the fire. I need to get this. What are my goals? How do I interpret what's happening to me right now? But intelligence that's not grounded in experience is in principle unreliable, right? And my favorite example of this, as I mentioned Wednesday, is conspiracy theories, where you can just run off and believe all kinds of things that you have no actual direct experience to confirm or deny, right? And of course, the best kinds of conspiracy theories are ones that are impossible to confirm or deny with your own experience. And then they just run on endlessly, right? So part of the wisdom aspect of this is recognizing that, right? Is recognizing the need for experience, is recognizing that our conceptual models are just models and not territory. But there's another aspect, you could say, of the wisdom here that Buddhists like Dharmakirti introduce, which is at the same time as recognizing that models are not models, also really always feeling, in a sense, being trained in a way in which one starts to actually feel that all of one's conceptualizations are inherently flawed. And let me explain that by referring to this object that's called a gata in Sanskrit. It's a kind of water pot, and so if you say gatoyam or gatoyam api, you can say this is also a pot. It involves this kind of cognition involves a kind of repeatability. And what in the Indian philosophical context is sometimes called the classical account, the way you explain repeatability is that there's some abstract entity that occurs in every pot, that is somehow present or inherent and hearing in every pot. And that is this gatatva, this potness. And that's why we can call every pot a gata or pot. And this entity is called a universal in Western philosophical terms, or a sameness. And the individuals can be called particulars, or swalakshana in Sanskrit. So here's a kind of diagram of this. The idea here is all of these are actually gata, but they look totally different, right? But they're all gata. There's nothing completely the same about any of these objects. The claim, actually, the strong claim that this system makes is there's nothing the same about any two objects that we ever encounter, actually, right? So we have to create that sameness. The classical account says the sameness is real. But since you can't see the sameness in those individuals, you have to make it an abstraction. So this is very much like the kind of notion of Platonic forms that Adam was talking about, and that's referenced in the blind spot. So for the classical account, universals are truly real. Particulars have their identity by virtue of, in some sense, holding those universals. The Buddhist account is going to reject all of this. They're actually going to flip the script. The idea that somehow, the Platonic version here, the classical Indian version doesn't really say the only real thing, truly real thing is the universal, the potness, the individual pots are somehow imperfect. They don't really go in that direction. That's Plato, or how we interpret Plato. But the Buddhists are going to really flip this script. So they're going to say that actually all that really exists is not universals. All that really exists are just these causally efficient particulars. And that's because the criteria for ultimate existence is causal efficacy, or arthakriya in Sanskrit, and only an actual pot can hold water. The idea of a pot, or the concept of a pot, can't do anything, actually, right? And so since universals don't ultimately exist because they're not causally efficient, all that remains are just these causally efficient particulars, which are themselves, each of them, completely unique. So if we're going to talk about things like pots, what we have to do is we have to see patterns where there are no real patterns. Right? So this is a very kind of strict form of nominalism in Western philosophical terms, that the patterns we see in reality are from the standpoint of our experience. But there are no real patterns in reality, because a pattern itself is an abstract entity. It's just another version of a sameness. So that's very important to understand. Patterns are another version of a kind of sameness. You see this pattern here, oh, that's the same pattern, or that's the same pattern, right? So that also is a kind of abstract entity, like a Platonic form, that we see repeated. Like we can talk about the pattern of a chair. We see that repeated, repeated, repeated. And in modern life, because of manufacturing, patterns look very similar, right? Repeated, repeated, repeated. But the pattern is only in our experience. It's not in reality. That's really getting your head around that takes a little work, especially if you're a scientist. So we're going to construct a kind of potness or a sameness. And how do we do that? We do that through a process called exclusion, which I am not going to explain because it would take me more than the rest of the day. But we can say then that the Buddhists have flipped the script here. Instead of saying that the universal is the truly real thing, and if we go all the way to the Platonic, they're going to say the only truly real thing are particulars, are the things that are directly presented in your experience. The things you see, that you feel, the things that you touch, that you smell, and so on, right? That's all that's actually real. Everything we think is, in a certain way, unreal. As mental events, they're real, but as what they're representing, they're not real, okay? So part of what this means is that conceptuality is ignorance, to quote Dharmakirti, vikalpa eva avidya. So for Dharmakirti, at the first level of analysis, he has multiple levels of analysis. But at the first level of analysis, the goal of wisdom is to know that when you're conceptualizing, you are ignorant. Meaning, and this is a specific way of interpreting this term ignorance, a translation of avidya. Another way of saying it is you're misknowing. Now, in other words, there's something that's distorting your cognition every time you're using concepts. But distorted cognitions can still work. I mean, we know that in many different ways. You can think that something is, it's a gallon of water, and you get over there and it's only a quart, or something like that. Seems like a strange example, but I couldn't think of anything else. So you can have something that's partially right, and it still works, right? That's also going to be the case here, of course. So what are the errors that are inherent in conceptualization? How is ignorance evident in conceptualization? What it does is, first of all, is it presents things as having some sameness, an ideal form, a universal, or we could say, for the purposes of the blind spot, a kind of mathematical characterization, a pattern, and so on. It presents things as having that, but they don't actually have that. And then secondly, the mental image, or the phenomenal form that's presented when we're thinking, right, is characterized that's characterized as having this universal or what have you, is characterized also as being a real thing in the world, out there in the world, right? So the concept, in other words, is presented as a real thing in the world, not just a product of our minds. There are probably good evolutionary reasons, if we step back from a Buddhist account, why we would do that, right? It probably is very important for us in a sense, if we're just surviving, especially maybe we're animals conceptualizing, you know, it's probably important for us to think that our thoughts about predators are real so that we actually act on them. I won't say more. So these distortions cannot be learned. This is important. You can't learn these distortions. They have to be built into your experience. Why can't they be learned? Because you never actually experience, for example, two things as the same. Your sensory content is never identical. You look, oh, this is a chair, that's a chair. But the sensory content when I'm looking is different. So I have to actually, I can't learn sameness by, for example, visual experience, right? I also can never learn that a concept is a real thing in the world because I never see concepts in the world. I only experience them in my mind. You can't have a sensory experience of a concept, right? So they have to be built into your system. So the point here is that these two distortions, which we can, with going back to our diagram, we can characterize this way, right? So one of them is that when I say something's blue, I am, in a sense, having a repeated cognition and anviya pratipatti in Sanskrit, where this is blue is like, again blue. Oh, here's another blue thing, right? That repeatability, and the concept presents itself as a real thing out there, right? So that's really key to understand that those two kinds of distortion are actually built into our experience. And here I think what's quite interesting is that this is Dharmakirti's version of the surreptitious substitution in the blind spot. Which is to say that, well, but it's not, we're not substituting very extremely abstract mathematical models and so on. We're actually substituting all the freaking time, right? All of our conceptualizations we think are what's real, like, oh, that's blue, that's a chair, that's this. And we are effacing that non-conceptual level of, or the pre-conceptual level of experience. So we take our conceptual interpretations to be what's real. Right? So that's his version of the blind spot, and it's interesting, it has actually two features, which I don't think you guys did. You do the like, oh, it's a real thing in the world, but I don't think you guys really did the, like, the repeatability, like the seeing the pattern is itself also part of the substitution, right? It's required for that substitution. But there's also a possibility of error at this level. Another kind of error relevant to the blind spot. And one way to talk about this is oh, I'm missing a slide. Or I have a slide out of, oh, there is, no, they're out of order. Oh, well. So I wanted to talk about Gofi. This is from Thomas Metzinger. Gofi means good old-fashioned intentionality. It's just a sense of being that when you're looking at me, for example, right, you're just like, oh, he's over there. There's an in-here-ness, like somebody's in here, the sense of subjectivity, seeing a world out there, for example, using vision, right? So that's that structure that in Western philosophy is called intentionality, or grahya grahaka in Sanskrit, grahya grahaka bhava, the relation of object and subject, so subject-object duality. And part of one of the things we can do is we can, in a sense, bracket, in using the terminology of phenomenology that you've heard before, you can bracket the sense that what you're seeing is out there and just consider that structure within your experience itself. In other words, bracket the question is that, so what Husserl calls the natural attitude is that, oh yeah, there's a world out there and I'm an experiencer in here. And you bracket that, you sort of bring that within your experience. And you set aside the question of what even does out there mean. You're just observing it from the standpoint of experience. And I think part of what this means, and this Dharmakirti also says, is built into our cognition. This is an innate feature of our cognition. And part of what that means is, for me, it just seems like, you know, the bifurcation that you guys get from Whitehead, it's just like inevitable, right? If you don't have bracketing, if you don't understand, if you don't have the wisdom to do bracketing, then bifurcation is just inevitable, I would think. In other words, we're all of us are at a certain level of doing that kind of bifurcation already, and especially when we start to reflect on our experience, it's going to seem that way. So part of what that means also is that, as you can see, even at this non-conceptual level, right? Even at this non-conceptual level, it can be flawed in the sense that, we don't see clearly enough to know whether this is really blue or green, or whether it's fire or something, or a flower. But it is also, for Dharmakirti, innately flawed, because it has this structure itself of object-subject. And because at Dharmakirti's first level of analysis, he's going to treat this causal stuff as being matter. At the second level of analysis, he's going to say matter is an unnecessary postulate. So the idea that there's like a world that's somehow different than whatever makes up our experience, that's wrong. That's an unnecessary, his way of doing that is unnecessary postulate. This is what's called Yogacara perspective. It is, I'm not going to go into the details. It's not idealism. People call it idealism. It's really not a form of, at least not subjective idealism. And then his final level of analysis, if anyone can guess, is that the causality isn't actually really going on either. But we're not going to do that today. So let me now turn to another issue, right? Like how then, okay, so Dharmakirti is going to say at his first level of analysis, we have this stuff, we're interacting with it, this like material stuff, we're interacting with it, and then we have these sense impressions, and then we conceptualize it, and we see patterns where there are no actual patterns, and we think that our concepts are, the patterns we're seeing are out there really in the world, but it works. Like, we can make our way in the world, we can survive, right? And we do better when we have the wisdom to recognize that those things are actually built-in distortions in our experience. When we don't think they're built-in distortions in our experience, then we think that patterns, abstractions, mathematical abstractions, concepts are real, and we'll even die for them under certain conditions. And we also think that the patterns, we also think that, when I see this and that, those are both chairs. And I don't see them in their particularity anymore. I see two people now, they're both X's. Whatever. And it's like, I'm done. I don't need to know that. I don't see them in their particularity, right? So that is how wisdom allows us to say, well, I think they're the same, but I know they're not. I mean, I'm thinking they're the same, but experientially, if I look at my experience carefully, I see that they're not. Right? So that's a kind of wisdom that, as I said on Wednesday, AI seems completely incapable of, because it can't experience. But also, there's another kind of wisdom which is actually calling into question the entire conceptual framework that we're using. Right? So that's another higher level of wisdom. And one way to think about that is really calling into question the very notion of causality itself. That's one version of that. Okay, so, right, this image. So let me imagine, let me ask you to, for a second, just, imagine that we are in Austria at this beautiful place in Scharnstein, and, we're about to, and somebody comes running into the house. This actually happened to me. And they say, come outside. It was the day before I was starting a seminar on Buddhist philosophy at this Dharma Center. And they say, look at this. And I mean, I know. They all said, it's you. No. They were kidding, of course. But so it's really quite an amazing picture, like this double rainbow. I think you can see that it's double. So this is at Gomde, Austria, is the institution. And then now let's suppose we do that, and then we go back inside. Like we look at it, and we go back inside, and then I ask you, right, or you ask me, how are you feeling while you were looking at that? And you go, I don't know, I was looking at it and I have no idea what my emotions were. So my emotions are not, or my affect is not encoded in my memory of that sensory experience. So I need to go back outside again and I'll look, and then I'll look in and check how I'm feeling. Does anyone report themselves as having an experience like that? I'm seriously curious. Or When we like go back inside and I say, how did you feel? You can say, oh, I felt like, or this or that, or like amazement, or, you know, or boredom, whatever it is, but you could report on your affect, especially if it's strong, right? Or like if a bus comes running at you, and or you know, a bus comes driving at you, and you know, you jump out of the way, and afterward I say, how did you feel? Were you afraid? And I say, I don't know. I need. Let's do it again so I can check. So how does that work? So in the Buddhist world, in Dharmakirtian philosophy at least, the way that works is what's happening in those cases is that in that moment, instead of the object, the subject, the phenomenal form of the object playing a dominant causal role, here the phenomenal form of the subject is playing a dominant causal role. And subject here means not just a sheer sense of subjectivity, it's everything having to do with the subject, your affect and so on, even probably your body position, right? All kinds of things that are kind of going into the subjective framing of that, of the presentation of that experience, of that object. So when you do that, then the report you give, oh, I felt this, I felt that, according to this model, this is the causal process that's involved. You essentially, in a sense, objectify yourself in the conceptual moment, right? But what you're doing is you're drawing on information that was not about an object, it was actually about your sense of subjectivity. Okay? So how is that possible? Because in order to do that, you're not going to turn at this, you know, level here, you're not introspecting. This is not happening through introspection. Right? You're not turning inward. Instead, this is playing this major role in the conceptualization. So at this point, you could call the conceptualization introspection, but it's conceptual. Right? And we often think of introspection as not conceptual. So how does this work? Well, the idea here is that every moment of awareness is also reflexively aware. And what that means is that, so one way to understand this term reflexive is to think of, this is really coming from reflexive pronouns. So there's a reflexive pronoun in Sanskrit, swa samviti, or in Tibetan, rangrig, that's being used here. So a reflexive pronoun, if you know Spanish or French, right? So you can say, yo hablo español, or you can say, se habla español. Yo hablo español, I speak Spanish, is a transitive verb. If I use that reflexive pronoun, the verb, which is usually intransitive, becomes intransitive. Se habla español. Or in French, je vois ça. I can say, ça se voit. The se, it's the same pronoun, just different language, right? It takes a transitive verb, I see that, and it makes it intransitive. You can't do this in English. Right? You can't say, you know, you can't say like Spanish speaks itself. Doesn't work. So we end up making it passive. Spanish is spoken. So like, you know, the sign, aquí se habla español, is like Spanish is spoken here, but that's not, it's not really, aquí español es hablado would be the literal translation of that English phrase, right? It's not passive. It's taking a transitive verb and making it intransitive. So this kind of self-awareness is better translated as reflexive awareness. The usually transitive action of knowing is made intransitive. So that all of the experience happening at the moment, everything that's being presented in consciousness, is being presented intransitively. The claim is that's all that's actually happening, but we have a sense of transitivity because of the subject-object structure. Okay? So then, what does this imply, besides being just fun, geeky Buddhist stuff? We already did this, sorry. How did that happen? Okay, here we go. So part of what this applies is that these phenomenal forms are arising simultaneously with the mind itself, and at every moment, they are being reflexively presented. Now, that means that the reflexive awareness itself is actually already non-dual, which means you're already having non-dual experience in every moment. Like your experience right now is non-dual. It just seems dual because it's got that structure in it. But actually the way it's working is how you're knowing is it's all presented at once. because your sense of subjectivity is being presented to you, but it's not being presented to you as an object, right? Like, you know, if I wave my hands, do you feel like I'm over here and like you're somehow there's a sense, some sense of subjectivity that's seeing me over, right? Do you have to say, no, I'm not sure if it's me seeing you. Let me look in to check if it's me. Oh no, it's actually Adam. Oh damn. Right? It's just presented. So you're knowing that sense of subjectivity is being presented with the object. It's all presented at once. But that presentation itself is non-dual. Okay? And the metaphor for this in Sanskrit is prakasha. It's actually not just a metaphor. There are certain experiences which feel like luminosity or light. Right? The idea is like the light of consciousness is just turned on, and anything that's there is going to be presented in consciousness, right? So one of the main roles of this in our ordinary experience is to present affect. Like while you're looking at something, it's like, I want that. Or I don't want that. I want to get rid of that. I want to run away from that. And on the Buddhist account, what affect does is it motivates behavior. So one way of thinking, so that's why in some early Buddhist accounts in particular, the solution to this dysfunctional behavior, like we're behaving to try to get happy, it doesn't work, so how do we solve it? We stop affect. We stop wanting. But then in later Buddhist accounts, and especially in Mahayana, the problem is actually not affect. It's not wanting. The problem is that our knowledge our awareness is distorted. So it's not the affect itself, it's that in a sense, the information that we're using to try to get what we want is all screwed up. Right? And we've already seen that. Like I conceptualize someone as attractive or whatever, and then I have a whole set of inferential associations with that conceptualization, and I go over there and I think, oh, that's the way it really is, or you know, this is my partner, and then I have a whole set of associations with that concept, and then you know, things don't work out according to my concepts. And you mean my concepts aren't reality? Oh dear. Now what can happen under certain circumstances, of course, and part of here's a very important claim, like, okay, so what is the role of this sense of reflexivity in consciousness? And under certain circumstances, that sense, the structure itself of duality, but even the content can just go like that. And you're still conscious, but you're not conscious of anything. And it's really saying you are conscious, is already like, who's you in this frame? Right? There's no like subject knowing objects. If you want to like reify that moment into your great soul or something, you can do that. Right? It is just sheer reflexive experience, or what would be called luminosity. And there are, of course, specific meditation techniques that are meant to induce this in the non-dual traditions. So one way to think about this is that this is talking about the minimal sense of being experiential. And I'm involved in some projects using psychedelics, so like 5-MeO DMT, because people say, I don't know. There may be some people who here who do know that if you take the right dose of that particular drug, otherwise known as toad, you can end up in a state that seems to be like this. Someone's probably going to make me do it someday, but I'm not sure I want to, but here you go. These kinds of experiences, right? The claim here would be you're still conscious, and that's what people report. And of course, also when you induce this through non-dual practices, people report, like, you can get into a state, This is not necessarily desirable, like the elimination of content is not strictly necessary according to many non-dual traditions, or even desirable, but you can induce it and you're still conscious. So what that's telling us is that consciousness, as a kind of minimal aspect of consciousness, you're still aware, right? You don't feel like you're unconscious, like you're asleep. You're still aware. Is that this, we can call this a kind of phenomenality, a sense of being aware. And the way in the Buddhist tradition this would be explained is as empty, meaning it's not got any structure in it, it's not got any content in it. It can have content, it can have structure. In that sense, it's also called magak, like, sort of malleable, completely radically flexible, but it doesn't have to. So it's intrinsically, it's empty. It's reflexive in the way that we stated, and it's luminous in the way that we stated. Okay? So, this brings us to the question, I've just got 5 minutes more, question of sentience. This is a slide from Evan's talk, that sense of feeling of being alive, or the being alive feeling. And I thought, great, I think this is a great way of thinking about sentience, and that how he describes feeling, and the role of the body in the sense of being alive, in the sense in being as presence. That's the one I'm got some curiosity about. And what it mean that could all life be sentient? That's right, we heard this from Evan. So here are some difficult questions. This, by the way, this is an image generated through Microsoft Copilot that uses DALL-E, and the prompt was, draw me a Buddha considering some difficult questions. What I got was a Burmese monk thinking about difficult questions. That's close enough. It's like, maybe he is a Buddha. I mean, what the heck? Okay. Does sentience require reflexivity? I think on Evan's account, in some sense, perhaps yes. Because part of the role of reflexivity is that while the organism is, in a sense, orienting itself to an object, it has to track itself in space-time. That's also a kind of reflexivity, arguably. It's not a second order. There certainly would be people who say, oh, there's some kind of second order cognition going on, maybe they're oscillating, whatever. But one account could certainly be, and probably a very efficient account would be, you just have a reflexive way of tracking space-time while you're orienting toward an object. Right? Like the sugar gradient even. So it seems like reflexivity could be needed for sentience. Does sentience require phenomenality or presence? I don't know. Because could reflexivity, the Buddhist account would be reflexivity is always phenomenal. But could reflexivity be like a sub-phenomenal kind of process? I mean, and then the question is, does consciousness require phenomenality? The Buddhist answer to all three of these is yes. At least the Dharmakirtian answer is yes. Beyond that, here's another toughie though. Can we infer consciousness in others? And the basic answer is, and this brings us to this slide from Kristen's presentation. I love the fact that she used the word markers, because that's basically a direct translation of the Sanskrit word that's used in this context, the linga, the markers of consciousness. This is the main topic of Dharmakirti's text, one of his smaller texts called the Santanantara Siddhi, which means the proof of other minds. And basically the question here is consciousness extremely remote epistemically, which means that you can't infer it based upon, you can't infer it empirically, right? And he kind of, in my opinion, he sort of, like, that text sort of does a little hand waving about that question. There are some claims about extraordinary circumstances where minds literally blend together, right? But he doesn't consider that in that text. For him, if we're going to infer other consciousness, it looks a lot like what Kristen was talking about. It's like volition, communication, interaction, pain, right? But are these inferences reliable? And again, I think the way I read that text is when you ask him that, he says, look at the bird. So Who knows? Thank you very much. So I guess we'll take a few minutes. Should we take a break and then come back and go into what do you think, Roshi, or just go right into it? Let's just go on. Okay, let's all come on up. Let's get our panelists, and we can respond to my talk, but also, hopefully we can think about other concluding thoughts or questions that anyone wants to raise. We'll take a few minutes with our participants online and in person, and then we'll try to open it up more generally and hopefully take some time for questions from you all too. So maybe about 10 minutes or so now, Roshi, with panelists. I don't know if Luke is still on. Yes, here's Evan. Here's Luke. Great.
Yes, I'm still there.
Great, it's good to see you. So anyone, I'm doing reflexive moderation.
I have some thoughts.
Yeah, go for it. What a surprise.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that was great, John. As a philosopher, of course, I love this kind of stuff. So I have a question for you, and then I also just wanted to respond to some of the questions that you put up in the slide toward the end there. So the question for you is, if we think of the contemplative setting as a workshop where we are both, let's say, constructing and discovering, or constructing certain kinds of experiences, and in doing that, we're also discovering things about the mind. How would you regard the deep philosophical differences in the Indian context that cut across the Buddhist world? Well, we could even point to deep differences within the Buddhist world, whether awareness is reflexive or not. Some, as obviously some Buddhists say yes, some Buddhists say no. Yeah. Within the Brahminical world of contemplative philosophy, they say the same thing. Vedanta says yes, Nyaya says no. So are those just philosophical differences, or do they have experiential consequences? And to make it more specific, what I'm wondering, maybe with the analogy, is that rather like the disagreements we have in interpreting quantum mechanics? There's certain basic things we agree on about measurement, and we have equations that we agree on, but then we have wildly divergent views about what those equations mean, with like many worlds at one end and cubism at the other. So would that be the analog in the Indian?
I don't think exactly, because it's sort of like you can build different workshops, and when you're at a certain level of inquiry, you can come up with what seem to be incommensurate conclusions. But then if your methods converge at some point, you may find that your conclusions also converge. Or if your workshops get better, then in a workshop here really means like a whole community of inquiry, right? But also, it's not necessarily the case, I think even in science too, but if we just think of the contemplative workshop, if I'm trained in a contemplative practice, I'm necessarily discovering features of the mind. I might be, but what I could be discovering is like, what can I do to the mind? Like, does this work? And what does that tell me about the mind as a result of doing that? From the standpoint, using a phenomenological method. That doesn't mean I'm necessarily, so for just a very concrete example of that, and this is a partial response to what you're saying, not all traditions use the techniques, many of them basically tantric techniques, that were required to induce that kind of state where you're conscious, but you have no content, right? So there were ethical concerns about how you induce that state with Tantra, and people had certain kinds of had commitments or vows that would prevent them from doing that. So, but let's think of that as a kind of tantric workshop. You can teach people that, you can give them the conceptual apparatus and the motivation to do it, and then they can do it. So the claim there would be, well, I'm still conscious, just like taking maybe a sufficiently high dose of a psychedelic, I'm still conscious. So if you guys say I have to have content, for example, or I have to have dualistic structure, either we have to discount my report or else you're wrong. But that is a product of the workshop, right? Which means that doesn't mean I'm discovering necessarily the nature of consciousness. I'm discovering that that's what I can do to consciousness. Okay, so that, I don't know if that's in some ways kind of partial answer.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, just to pursue it a little bit further, I guess what I'm wondering is with the workshop analogy, agreeing with everything that you just said or accepting everything you just said, how you would see the difference between, say, the tantric Buddhist workshop and the Shaiva tantric workshop? Like what's the nature of the difference there? Is it a normative difference?
That's a very good example of that sounds more like quantum physics to me.
Okay.
Because they're like using very similar methods. They're producing very similar phenomenal reports. And I kind of nastily said, well, if you want to call that, that moment of pure reflexive, empty luminous consciousness a great soul, you can. Well, that's kind of, they call it Shiva, right?
Right.
So, and you can even use that term. And in fact, you even find that term Mahatma in some Buddhist tantras. There's a lot of overlap between. So for me, yes, that sounds more like we workshopped in a very similar way, we came to certain conclusions, but for whatever reason, we're looking for grants from different agencies.
Right, and they have something like a many worlds.
We come up with different conceptual accounts.
Right. And they have something, the Shaivas, more like a many worlds interpretation compared to, say, a Buddhist, maybe more like a Cubist interpretation or a Copenhagen interpretation.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So, and I think then the real question there is, and I think for the Dharmakirtian perspective is both of those are false, ultimately. They're neither just models. And the question is, what does the model do for us? Which model, given our goals, for example, relieving suffering, which of those models works better? And it's possible that different models work better for different people, which is also classical Buddhist.
And different eras.
And different eras, yeah.
It has so much to do with you.
Yeah.
Right, great. So the other thing I'll just say quickly is, you raised this very interesting question about sentience and reflexivity. And I would answer yes. And my reasons for answering yes would be that I do think that sentience, in the sense of the being alive feeling, is reflexive in exactly the way you described. And I think that in part for reasons coming from Indian philosophies of reflexivity, but also from phenomenology in the Western tradition, where the idea of pre-reflective awareness is really the same idea as the idea of reflexive awareness. And I go into this in the paper that I mentioned on one of my slides, Could All Life Be Sentient? I actually go into that connection in that paper.
Yeah, I actually didn't even know about that paper, so I'm really looking forward to reading it. Anyone else want to? Oh, there's Luke. Go ahead, Luke.
Yes, so you talked a lot about conceptualization within a single mind, right? Now, what about if you have more than one? Because for example, if we use language, we express our conceptualizations with words, and in one way or another, the person we are speaking to has to reconstruct or evoke, in some sense, similar conceptualizations.
Right.
I'm going, of course, to this thing of participatory sense making, where you need a way to share your conceptualizations or categorizations of the world without there being any, well, at least that's an assumption, that there's no telepathic way, right? There's a way that both of them work independently, but they coordinate their activities, both minds.
Yes, Dharmakirti definitely has an account of that. It's a little dim in my memory right now, but I do remember it's not a very robust account, but it is important for his system for when he deals with language. He really discusses that primarily in the context of human cognition, or maybe entirely, and especially language use, so that we have shared, essentially, a key aspect of his system is that we, through experience, not innate, we have certain innate structures that I talked about, but our conceptual systems or frameworks are learned, and they're learned intersubjectively. And a lot of that sort of intersubjective interaction, it would appear from Dharmakirti's standpoint, he doesn't get into this too much, but drawing on some other texts in this Yogacara tradition, a lot of that intersubjective interaction is not linguistic, actually. Like there's a pre-linguistic level of intersubjectivity. So he says that, and one of the things I wanted to raise that I didn't get to talk about was standpoint epistemology. And this difficulty is like, it sounds like, that kind of preconceptual moment is sort of a indubitable, like, given for a kind of foundation epistemologically, but actually from his standpoint, it's something that is shared across, there is a sense of the indubitability of like, oh, I feel hot, that is shared across a community of knowers who are in some sense living in a shared life world. But if you live in a different life world, it's always a shared life world, but if you live in a different shared life world, you're not going to feel warm. So, it plays a very, that sense of not just linguistic, like communication. And he does talk about how we do that. He basically gives an inferential account of language, of how language works, where we're inferring intentions through language. But the sense of there being a kind of larger intersubjective, not just conceptual framework, but even a sort of perceptual context that's shared, that's very important for his system. I see Richie. But that's a great question. Look, I mean, it's basically one of the places where that system, where I think the enactive perspective gives us a lot more. Dharmakirti is an interesting, I think there are some reflections that come out of this material that are really useful, and that are really useful also in contemplative context. But there are lots of gaps, and that's one of them. Yes, Richie.
So thank you. Thank you for the great presentation. And this is a question really directed to both you, John, and to Ev. But given the link that you are trying to make between sentience and reflexivity, I wonder what you can say about how we can make inferences about reflexivity.
Can you give me an example of a kind of inference you want to make?
How do we know whether reflexivity is present? What's our measure of reflexivity? What's our marker of reflexivity?
Like axis, right? Bacteria. How would you say whether or not?
Well, I think that's why I think that's the excellent question. So in the context of the Dharmakirti with human cognition, he actually has an extended debate with one of the schools that Evan was alluding to, the Nyaya Vaisheshika, who reject the idea of reflexivity. And he, based first on experience, like we're able to report our affect, especially strong affect. And we don't have the experience where if we have strong affect, where it seems like we have to go re-experience something in order to make the report. So the question is then, what's the mechanism that enables us to do that? And part of the way that operates is through, not just through kind of empirical argument, but also through like a principle of parsimony, or lagutva, which means it's basically Occam's razor. Like, don't invent things just because you want them to be the case. Like, what's your simplest explanation? In the case of a much simpler organism, I think what you'd have to go in a different direction. But I think that principle of parsimony would be important. Like, what would enable an organism to do this in a minimal, most efficient way? What kinds of structures in the organism could hypothetically enable that. And Evan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would say something very similar. I would say that that within the, let's call it sort of theoretical, psychological, and excuse me, phenomenological context, the reasoning that leads to reflexivity is a kind of inference to the best explanation, a kind of abductive inference, where the alternative would be some kind of higher order metacognitive process that wouldn't, on this way of thinking, account for this more basic primitive kind of reflexivity. If so, those arguments are sort of theoretical phenomenological ones. They're worked out in quite a bit of detail, both in phenomenology and Indian philosophy. I won't lay them out here, but then if you ask, as a scientist, as a cognitive neuroscientist or as a biologist, well, how would I identify, the critical biological processes that would be, minimally sufficient for reflexivity? That's actually an extremely difficult question, because by hypothesis, it's invariant across any, fluctuation or change. So you'd have to have a way of targeting it experimentally as an invariant, rather than as something that you're changing or manipulating in relationship to contents of experience. So that's you probably have more ideas about that.
Well, I wasn't so much really asking about the mechanisms that may underlie it, but particularly in an organism that can't talk.
Okay.
What's your marker of reflexivity?
Ooh, I'm jumping in. Going in. I think in some sense there's a way of doing this, or at least there's a direction away, which is what I talked about last year, which is information theory. You can actually look at the correlations between the, in an informational sense, between the environment and the agent, and how they're behaving, and how those correlations are established, manipulated, drawn from, returned, that there may be some echo in some sense of that, the reflexivity of that, the agent has an awareness of its own state. I mean, we're doing a set of studies right now where we're just trying to look at the different information architectures for just like a forager that is completely blind, it just has no sense that there's anything out there, but it's just wandering randomly. A forager that knows I'm hungry, right? And there's a bit of information about its own internal state, and a forager who has that and also has some kind of sensor. So these are all very crude ways of doing this, but this is the beauty of information theory, I think, is that it offers a way to sort of understand the agent as not just this thing, sort of in an abstraction, but actually embedded in the environment. And then again, my whole thing is that the agent and the environment they're co-emerging, right? They're never separate.
I like that. I like that response. Thank you, Adam. That was great.
Direction, I would just say, like everything when we talk about going beyond the blind spot, I think, John, everything you're talking about is laying down possible directions for, rather than the metaphysics that I was talking about, that was the blind spot metaphysics. What you're talking about may be offering us directions for a post-blind spot metaphysics that we can rest science on.
Any other thoughts? Maybe we'll open it up for a few minutes.
I want to ask a question of you, John. I know some of us are engaged in addressing issues related to structural and direct violence in the world. And, how does this perspective inform actions in the world and ethics?
Yeah, and I think that the place where that is really key is, so there's two things. One of them is basically that sense, which becomes, in contemplative practice, this is something that you do experientially, is recognizing that my beliefs are not reality. That including actually my ethical intuitions are not reality. Like if I feel something is wrong, like maybe I feel, I feel that, I don't know, marriage between Irish and Italian is just wrong. It's just wrong. And, there are other kinds of marriages, but I'm not going to reference those. Just like, I just feel that. I just know it. And, and how did I get that? Well, I think it's just the way reality is. I actually acquired that through some kind of series of experiences and family culture or whatever. But the way, when I'm acting in a certain fashion, when I'm oppressing, it's because I don't recognize that this is just, a product of my own conditioning. I think it's the way things are. So that's that moment. That's not an easy thing, obviously, to work against. But then to work against that deep sense of conviction about the truth of my beliefs. Not just truth, like the reality of not just that they're true, but that they're real. That's tough. And then, so you have to undermine, like constantly undermine that. And then the second, and one's own, because if you only undermine the other, then it's just saying, well, yours are just wrong, mine are right, right? And then the second really, challenging thing that is, in a sense, kind of reflexively, if you like, becoming fully aware of our own stuff and what is, what is all the conditioning that's gone into my perspective, because part of what that does is then enables us to have a kind of empathy, even if we don't, even for those who are causing harm, like to really, in a sense, be able to understand that and therefore become maybe quite good at helping them out of it.
I mean, I think the question that comes up for me is how this view could produce that perspective that you're articulating, but it also could produce passivity.
Well, since it's all, this particular view is always...
apropos of your Wednesday talk.
Yes.
Of the relative and the absolute.
Yes, yeah. And I think, that would, one of the metaphors that's used in this context is called prematurely falling into emptiness.
Thank you.
Which is why this is always in like the 8,000 line perfection of wisdom. More, well, yeah, I couldn't, but then, and then the worst version of that is called the attachment to emptiness, clinging to emptiness, reifying emptiness. Like Nagarjuna said, if your own philosophical position becomes emptiness, like emptiness is true, then you're incurable, is what he said. But I think this is why this material is always presented in the context of bodhicitta. Like, you cultivating compassion, that's the baseline. You don't engage with this kind of philosophy at that level unless you're already working on compassion.
Thank you. I think that was my concern.
I should have detected that.
Without the relative, without the cultivation of bodhicitta, one could easily use this as a way to completely dissociate from the context of one's lived experience that's characterized by suffering.
Well, I don't think that's true because this is still, but my beliefs are real. We could go on. I'm not going to respond to that but I just want to, what I will say is there is this sense of the primacy of experience that is so key there. So I don't know if you could do that and dissociate at the same time. That sounds like quite a trick, but maybe
there when I say dissociate, just to become so embedded in notions of the self.
Oh, well, no, that shouldn't happen because the whole idea is that, the self is just a construct. I thought that was clear, but maybe not. I don't know. I'm probably just spinning in my concepts.
So I think it'd be great to take some questions from our friends here in the room and one or two questions from our online community. So, yes. And, we're going to ask you to go to essence.
Thank you. By the time we deconstruct and understand all that we have constructed, and then we get to a kind of neutrality, I want to push your question further, which is, I know a lot of people who understand that where they are is not reality, and once they get to a kind of nothingness, also get to a place of doing nothingness.
It's not,
So how do we move to saying there is something good that we can construct, or a moral, or an ethic, or an action?
Yeah, so
how do we get there?
Yeah, so it's not nothingness. That's right? Not even that experience, that sheer experience of mere reflexive empty luminosity, that is not nothingness. That's a very important aspect of this system. It's not nothingness. One of the dangers of that kind of experience is it can become a kind of anesthetic, and I think you see that with use of psychedelics. People kind of can just use it as an escape. So if you get good at inducing that type of experience, it could be dangerous. But it's definitely not nothingness. And if you cling to it as nothingness, you're certainly not doing it right, for sure. And you probably will stop being able to do it. But yeah, but so another way to say this though is like, okay, so none of our models are real, and our ethical intuitions are not reality. It's not like, I think, I'm trying to remember.
But our experience of others' suffering.
It's sort of like if someone, let's suppose our like I have a squircle collection, square circles. In my closet. I think I've inherited this. It's been locked. You're not supposed to open it. And then you come along one day and you say to me, there's no such thing as squircles. And I go, what? My whole life has been about this protecting the squircles. And then like, no, and you open the door and there are no squircles. That's what this is like. Like, it's not like there's something we had that this takes away. We never had, a true model of the world. Or like, we never had a situation on this account where our like ethical intuitions are reality. Okay? So what we have is, we have experience of suffering of others and ourselves. And then we have the question like, well, what kind of world do we want to be in? Right? What kind of ethical system is going to help us with that world? What kind of conceptual systems, cultural practices, right? So that I think, so it's not like it should actually enable, it should motivate people. Like, well, oh, you mean we're not stuck? We can actually change everything? All of these frameworks that we've been working with are, not just reality. There isn't whatever framework you're having, sin or whatever it is, like, so that would be my perspective, right? And my basic position is that someone who gets caught in that kind of sense of like, apathy has just not gotten it. They haven't understood it. Didn't you want to say something, Molly?
I could just say that I think the point of practice is not to turn off emotions, but to develop a sense of equanimity around emotions so that you can act on them skillfully. And I think indifference is often confused with equanimity, but it's important to remember that they're not the same.
That's an excellent point. The so-called near enemy of equanimity.
Another question?
If I could just jump in and say a thing on this.
Oh, yes, Kristen. Yeah, sorry, we didn't see you.
Okay.
I'm behind you. That's why I can see you. I'm wondering if we can draw a distinction, if it would be helpful to draw a distinction between the concern and care and the content of what the concern and care is about. And some of these reflections can help us see that what's really core to being alive is care, is caring about something. And we have debates about what that thing should be because of the kinds of minds we have. We have ethical theories we create, which lead us to draw different conclusions. But when we engage in this kind of reflection, we can't deny that care is there. And it's not just in humans, we see it everywhere. I just need to say the name of Frans de Waal, who we lost in March. And he did an amazing job in his lifetime showing us that care is everywhere in animal community. Everywhere we looked for it, we found that animals care for one another. So there's that's deeply shared.
In Tibetan, this gesture means like number one, Angi Dangpo. And this means like beyond number one. There's actually, I did not talk about this account, but there's an additional account that says that kind of, when we talk about that minimal sense of what is consciousness, that includes another feature that is actually literally called compassion. But it is and when it's not confused, it is compassion. But it is like this kind of basic dynamic. The reflexivity is not static, it's dynamic, it's interconnected, it's inherently interconnected. So yeah, care, I totally get it. I love the way you put it.
I think the word I want to introduce here is appamata.
Also,
And
yeah.
which is, I think, important in relation to what we're exploring here. And it's usually translated as heedfulness or as vigilance. And the metaphor that is used in relation to the concept of appamata is of the elephant's footprint. And that is, all other valences fit within the footprint of the elephant. That we actualize this quality, and it is in part related to meta-awareness or metacognition.
Oh yeah, very much.
But the other thing that I appreciate is that sometimes it's also translated, and I like this, as conscientiousness. And this, this sort of sensibility of conscientiousness, imputes there is a kind of ethical base, but it's an ethical base that's based in experience, and it's non-conceptual. And the other word, the other translation that I have a lot of appreciation for, actually, is Stephen Batchelor's translation of appamata, which is care.
Oh, really?
And so I
appamata?
really and for a year, I've been harping on appamata. Anybody who's, heard me give a talk in the past year, appamata, appamata. I mean, it is true that how important it is to actually be vigilant or to be heedful. It is, we're always in the process of course correction. That's just the nature of our experience.
But, and I just want to be clear that this doesn't mean you don't have ethics or an ethical system or an ethical perspective. It's just that the way one holds that and the way one holds one's vows, are that there's a kind of, I won't even call it exactly flexibility. There's an openness, and there's a sense that they're not like just ends in themselves. That we have our vows and our ethics because we're transforming the world.
There's one other piece I just want to articulate here in this regard, and that has to do with the relationship between motivation, intention, commitments, and vows. And to, remind us that motivation is actually unfolding at a preconscious level. And what is conscious is, in our conscious awareness is our intentions. But part of the reason why practice is so important is not to reify these misapprehensions about what our motivations actually are. It's to bring into conscious awareness what are the values that are informing our motivation. And those, of course, if they're not aligned with our intentions, there's a kind of moral dissonance that people experience.
Yeah, and that's exactly that process of like uncovering the conceptual frameworks,
Exactly.
which the intentions are all about, right? They're the ones that are guiding those intentions.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then the other two dimensions have to do with our commitments. I mean, you can have intentions, but those intentions aren't necessarily actionable from the point of view of your motivation. And so, there's this other level, which is conscious. It's, what have we committed to, and are we going to keep our promises, so to speak? And then, of course, the vows refer to, these kind of ego-taming processes that we engage in order to actualize who we really are, which, we've referenced in the context of this experience. So I just, I wanted to bring up Appamada and also these four aspects, because they're, it's like a Venn diagram. They're interconnected, but they're also, not all of them, are in our awareness. So I think it'd be wonderful to hear, I see a hand raised, but I can't see who, and I'm just going to ask you to go to Essence. Also, I'm Jorge Andrade. I think you're, hi Frank.
Hi.
Also in Chile, if you're still online, you asked a few questions in the chat that I thought were terrific. So Frank, if you could go to Essence, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I was concerned and motivated by a lot of the work that's been done on wonder and awe. And I know, Joni, you read that book along the lines of self-transcendence.
You're echoing. Your sound is, you must have two devices on.
No, I don't. But
Oh, no, because someone else is listening.
self-transcendence, which was mentioned today, but I don't see many people doing much work on it. Alan Marlett did a lot of work on the 10-day Vipassana program in the University of Washington, where he had prisoners that were guilty of murder totally transcend themselves by doing 10 days of Vipassana meditation in total silence. And I was wondering if you know about anything about that as far as self-transcendence. Was this something Abraham Maslow talked about in 1969, and I don't see too many people talking about what he did.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So I think Richie, began to open that question up, and John, certainly in your presentation, maybe Richie and John, you each can do a brief reflection for Frank.
Thank you.
Well, briefly, I appreciate you asking about that, Frank. And it's true. I think that it has been ignored for many years. It was raised early on by people like Maslow, but it's seeing a resurgence now, in part because of psychedelic research, in part because of meditation research, and in part because psychologists are taking on experiences like awe and wonder and treating them as serious topics of scientific inquiry. So it's slowly happening.
I think, Frank, did you refer to Dr. Keltner's new book on awe? Did I hear you?
Yes.
Yeah. So I haven't actually read it yet. I know Dr. a bit and know some of his other work in that area. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. I think it's a great topic, and awe is, one of many kinds of experiences that are self-transcendent. So, maybe we'll do something about that here someday. I think it's a great topic.
Year.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting you raised it, because we actually have we've been talking about that as a possible topic. So maybe it's a very important. I will say that many of the non-dual practices in the Tibetan tradition deliberately invoke awe and similar self-transcendent affective experiences as a for cultivating.
And of course, it's a valued experience within the Zen context. Jorge.
Thank you.
I see your images jumping around, so we might have an issue with connectivity with you.
Yeah.
But anyway, fire forth.
Okay.
You are the miscreant.
Maybe connectivity.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
No, I just a few. Sorry, I think I have an.
I think what you should do, Jorge, just in terms of time, if you could put your inquiry into chat, because we're not able to actually hear you or see you that well. It's all right.
Yeah.
Just put it in chat. And
of
course, I can't see it.
Yeah, can you open the chat window for us, please?
Maybe you can.
Maybe while Jorge's working on that, we could take one more from the audience, and then or from online?
Any more questions here? Yes.
How
you doing?
I think my microphone is okay now. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Thank you. If you could just wait, tell Jorge.
Could you close the chat window, please?
Yeah, thank you. No, I just had a few comments on statistical thinking in our classrooms in the sense of Luke regarding the tokens coming together, and also on the uniqueness of human capacity for self-deception. And further, I was missing this sort of action perception loop in the picture that John showed us regarding the eye regarding the blue ball. I wrote this in the chat before. I don't know, you have any comments on this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That diagram is a model of a model, and I couldn't represent everything, but the entire model is based on the idea that the cognitive processes that are being described are all about action in the world. In other words, the way Dharmakirti puts it is that conceptualization is not just a bad habit. We do it because we want stuff. We want the good things, and we want to avoid the bad things. We want affordances, and we want to avoid dangers. And that's what's driving the entire cognitive system. Even that preconceptual, in other words, what we pay attention to preconceptually is not neutral. It's already driven by those motivations. So maybe I can think about, if you have any ideas, please, send me an email. Think about some way to represent that better in the diagram, because it's a very, very important part of that system.
Thank you, John. I'm going to be mindful about time.
Okay.
Yeah, really. I'm so grateful for the deliberations, and I also, we have to conclude our exploration now and do some preparation about how we move out of our rooms in this space and then into lunch. But I just want to mention one other thing, and that is just so deeply appreciative of the time our faculty friends have given to not only this particular symposium, but also in general to the extraordinary work that they have done in their lives in their various fields. And also to Upaya's residents who bring the spirit of practice into how this place is kept and offered to all of you. And I thank you all. So it's really, plus it's kind of fun being with you, hanging out. And I'm going to ask Talia to come up as she's transitioning. Again, we were able to gin a little bit of support for our symposium this year, and I'm grateful for a good friend. But also your donation make it possible for us to support the faculty and also to support this amazing amount of online content, learning and practice that Upaya offers every year. I mean, we're talking about hundreds upon hundreds in our wisdom library of teachers and practice opportunities and trainings that we make available. And it only really happens through you. Your donations make it possible. As you know, 90% of what we offer online is completely free, including online the deliberations this weekend. So I encourage you to give generously. Talia.
Thank you all for being here for this symposium. This is relevant particularly to those who have been staying here these past few nights. You may have seen a linen pack dropped outside of your door or just an instruction sheet So for those that are staying in rooms with twin beds, you have linen packs. If you don't have twin beds, there's just an instruction sheet on how you can tend to your room in the spirit of leaving no trace. We don't have AI bots to give you instructions yet. Hopefully they're self-explanatory enough, and I'll be in the area as well. You can bring your linens to the housekeeping garage, and just as best as you can in this period, it makes a big difference how you care for this space and reset it to as much as possible how you found it. Housekeeping team thanks you greatly, and deep bows for your practice. They're at the far end of Krentzia, and is a housekeeping garage, and there's laundry bags, and I'll be in that area. Yeah.
And then I want to offer special thanks to John. You were, since Al is retired from the position as moderator, thank you, Al, for all you gave all those years. And John, thank you. I'm inviting you to